This week, exactly 35 years ago, authorities were in the middle of conducting a borough-wide manhunt in relation to a horrific set of events that unfolded on Halloween night of 1990. Also the week that articles would start to circulate about what happened, telling the story of a man who had been living on the streets of New York City and faced a horrible end. Now at first, this might just sound like a story about tragedy striking on Halloween night, but in reality, it's about how this story, and many others just like it, raise a lot of concerns when it comes to how people view homelessness. What I hope to do is give a closer look at what those living on the street have to go through, the places they have to live, everything they have to endure, how people can sometimes be treated when it comes to situations that are sometimes beyond their control, an issue that is still very much present today. My condolences go out to the family and friends of Carlos Melendez, who I'll be discussing today. Now, I'd like to warn that today's story is going to contain certain details that are particularly graphic and can be very difficult to make it through. So before you jump in, please keep that in mind. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. Halloween, a favorite time of the year for many. Classic horror movies, candy, haunted houses, trick-or-treating, people from all over taken to the streets to show off their costumes and join in the festivities. In New York City, aside from the annual Halloween parade downtown, you can find events going on all over the 5 boroughs. Events at clubs, house parties, even hundreds just walking through the street enjoying everyone else's crazy outfits. A night meant to be full of fun and scares for everyone, regardless of your age. Unfortunately, Halloween also comes with its share of darkness. Things that take place after the sun sets that sound like more of the plot of a horror movie. There are some who leave their homes, don a mask, and venture off into the streets with an entirely different definition of what you and I might call fun, turning the otherwise happy, fun-filled evening into something much more sinister. On today's episode of Evil Intentions, this is No Shelter, the story of Carlos Melendez.
Tumbled down into a bottomless abyss of depression. By 1931, the nation tottered under the weight of 13 million unemployed. Industry had been struck a mortal blow. The public parks became a haven for families who had no money to pay even the lowest rents. President Herbert Hoover asked for appropriations from Congress to battle the unemployment problem, but he faced economic chaos that found some 1,300 banks closing in the first months of the Depression. The relief rolls were filled to overflowing. Public soup kitchens ladled out thin broth to long lines of the hungry. The first term of newly elected President Franklin Delano Roosevelt saw the battle against unemployment and poverty renewed with fresh vigor. The new administration faced the issue of a citizenry reduced to the lowest levels of hopelessness and despair.
In New York City, living paycheck to paycheck is unfortunately a reality many are more than familiar with. This is one of the most expensive cities in the world, which isn't news to anyone. Said in a study by wealth firm Henley & Partners to be the second most expensive city in the world, to be exact. Now, there are plenty of reasons why someone would end up on the street. From rising rent costs to loss of employment with no savings, many are struggling, trying their best to put one foot forward and make ends meet. New York City has reached record numbers when it comes to people living on the street, the highest numbers since the 1930s during the Great Depression. Whether you're in the Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, or different parts of Manhattan, we've seen more and more reports of the growing problem in the city. For many of those without homes, it's their first time ever experiencing something like this. Since 2019, there's been a 23% increase in first-time homelessness. Two of the biggest contributing factors are said to be the lack of low-cost housing and housing assistance programs. There's also issues concerning mental health, domestic violence, lack of employment opportunities, drug abuse, and lack of health care. All factors when it comes to the descent into living on the street. It's not something anyone plans, but once there, it could be one of the most challenging life experiences. When it comes to New York City, you won't find a New Yorker who's ever known a time when this wasn't a problem. It was always in the news, The city had ads in the train stations about it, and city officials were always discussing ways to combat the issue. I remember walking out of my apartment in the projects as a kid and seeing people sleeping in the staircases and in the hallways. My mom's told me they didn't have a place to live. That would be the first time I could remember seeing it with my own eyes, something that plenty of us saw pretty frequently. Others would sleep in the subway stations and on the trains, no different from today. I remember back when men and women who had fallen on hard times would get on the trains telling their stories about how they didn't have homes but lived in shelters. They were trying to get their lives back in order, offering sandwiches and fruit to others who may be hungry. It was a life they unfortunately knew well, because some organizations who were known to do this regularly were filled with volunteers who had first-hand experience of life on the streets. Over the decades, there have been numerous organizations that work hard to help, whether it be providing food and clothing, or shelter and access to programs that are designed to get people back on their feet. Some of those programs and shelters could be found on Ward's Island, just across the Harlem River. Specifically, the Charles Gay Shelter for Men, serving over 900 people. Now, Ward's Island and Randall's Island are part of Manhattan. A footbridge connecting over to the islands could be found on East 102nd Street, right by the FDR. Many travel on this bridge by foot or bike, using it daily. For a long time now, it's been open to the public all year round, 24 hours a day. Although there was a time when a decision was made to only keep the bridge open during the day and raise it at night. This was in an attempt to slow down the incidents taking place on this bridge on an almost daily basis. Everything from constant robberies to stabbings and shootings. The bridge was also known to often be occupied by local gangs and dealers. It popped up in the news often. The city constantly faced complaints about the lighting on the bridge and walkways on the island. The tall weeds and grass that hadn't been cut in years made it very easy to get jumped out on, a tactic used by plenty in robberies at the time. There was also many complaints about the lack of police presence on the bridge and Ward's Island. In a way, it felt like no man's land, a place either ignored or totally forgotten. Throughout the 80s and 90s, there were reports everywhere you looked, detailing the growing problem in the city. And even then, many believed it was just being blown out of proportion and not really an issue at all. For those who lived in the nicer parts of the city, it seems it was easy to miss. Although even that seems hard to believe. From Tent City and Tompkins Square Park to scattered parts of the Upper West Side, it's definitely always been a problem. Whether some wanted to acknowledge it or not, it was there. Pick up the paper to see what's going on in the world, and you could easily find articles about people living on the street right next to advertisements about living in luxury. Very hard to miss. While many wanted to see people land on their feet and showed empathy about their situations, for others, it was the opposite. They mostly viewed those living on the street as just criminals or being hooked on drugs, written off completely as if rehab doesn't exist, as if making major life changes and getting off the street is impossible. Not everyone's story is exactly the same. There's always a reason for why people end up where they do. Some become addicted to drugs after years on the street. Others end up on the street because of their addictions. Many never dealt with alcoholism or substance abuse at all. It was debt and lack of funds that just caught up with them. Of course, there are plenty of other reasons this could all happen. But for those who aren't educated on the topic or haven't seen it for themselves, the homeless can be seen as just an inconvenience that will never change. One thing's for certain, it definitely remains a nationwide issue. But over the decades, scattered throughout, are those who see those on the street as less than human and couldn't care less about their well-being. There are some who take great pleasure in the suffering of others, especially when those people can't do much to defend themselves. And the evening of Wednesday, October 31st of 1990 was a perfect example of that. Halloween night, over 35 years ago, a night where all regard for human life was completely lost. According to reports, it all started sometime between 9:15 and 9:50 p.m. near the East 102nd Footbridge that connects Manhattan to Ward's Island. As people made their way to and from Manhattan, a group of about 15 individuals started to make their way across the bridge, some dressed as Jason, the Grim Reaper, vampires, and other random costumes that concealed their identities. But their intentions once they stepped foot on this bridge weren't good ones. It wouldn't take long before anyone on that bridge who was just trying to make it back to Manhattan or to a shelter on the island found themselves being terrorized by the group. They took out bats, knives, pipes, and meat cleavers, striking anyone they came across, going into their pockets and telling people to give up their belongings. Other masked men in the same group brandished firearms, just to make sure nobody could even think of fighting back. While some might be familiar with Halloween pranks like jumping from behind a tree and scaring someone, or throwing eggs at people walking by, this was just another level entirely. This was a brazen attack by armed individuals. The dimly lit bridge could take a few minutes to cross, leaving anyone there when these people approached completely open to attack. No authorities, and no type of help on either end. The attacks would start to escalate very quickly, and it wouldn't take long for them to find their next victim. He was a man returning from Bible study, just trying to make it back to Ward's Island. His name was Anthony. He was a resident of the shelter there. Within moments, he had his head cracked open by a masked person wielding a wooden bat who was dressed as the Grim Reaper. The man tried his best to run away, but would end up getting cut off by another masked assailant, this one dressed as Jason from Friday the 13th. He also had a bat and began using it to hit the man in his face and head even more, causing his skin to tear open and bleed profusely. The attacks resulted in 32 stitches. Another man who had been hacked over and over in the face and head with a meat cleaver would receive 85 stitches. At this point, anyone who came into their field of vision was a target. It didn't matter if they were coming or going. If you weren't with them, you were getting attacked. It all unraveled so fast that it was hard to know what exactly was happening. No matter where pedestrians turned, there was another masked person with a weapon coming directly at them. Some gave up their cash in their pockets to avoid being critically hurt, assuming at first that this was just a hostile robbery and it would all be over soon. But just a few minutes into it all, they would realize that maybe money wasn't the only motivation for this attack. The masked individuals shouted angrily at people, and from the sounds of their voices, it sounded like a couple of them could have been younger, more like teenagers than grown adults. Anyone in the vicinity of that footbridge on both sides was in danger of being robbed and beaten. Part of the group remained on the bridge, while some of the others started to make their way to the Ward's Island end, where they waited on more unsuspecting victims. They then set their sights on the homeless encampments that covered a lot of Ward's Island's wooded areas. Without thinking twice, the masked men ran through tents, cardboard boxes, and any personal belongings, savagely attacking anyone that moved. Others ran as fast as they could, trying to make it to safety. It was unfortunately one of many times that they had been targeted. But something about this night felt very different, just much more cold, much more heartless. As they swung their pipes, cleavers, knives, and bats, the masked assailants yelled trick or treat and ordered victims to give up whatever they had on them. With so many swinging weapons of all sorts, it made it very difficult to do anything to fight back, no matter how hard they tried. Men were hit all over their bodies and heads repeatedly, stabbed multiple times if they tried to defend themselves. After attacking 9 homeless men total, the mob would come across their next victim, a man named Carlos Melendez. Carlos, just 35 years old, was said to be a man who had fallen on hard times in the mid-80s. He was a resident of Westchester prior to making the move into the city. From the early 80s until 1985, he worked as a social worker at the Westchester Association for the Mentally Challenged, where he was described as a goal-driven, hard-working man, as stated by a former co-worker. He had been married in the past and had a young child before things started to take a turn. He had struggled with alcoholism and drugs in the past, even spending some time in jail for drug possession. Because of this, he was known to be very understanding and sensitive to others facing similar challenges. He would listen to people, help feed them if they were hungry. He truly cared about them. He didn't lead a perfect life, but he had a kind heart. However, his life would take a drastic turn after an auto accident left him terribly injured. It was after this that Carlos moved into the city and started to struggle with drugs and alcoholism again. The injuries, substance abuse issues, and psychological impact of his accident would lead to Carlos living on the street, a future he never saw for himself. But he was determined to make changes and get his life back to where it was previously, so he could leave this path he found himself on far behind. He had been a part of different shelters in the past, including on Ward's Island and other parts of Manhattan. He was attending church services through the shelter on the island. He had also checked himself into rehab to kick his addiction. He was still a member of the shelter, but those who knew him could see that he wouldn't be there much longer. He was doing very well, so much so that he would kick his habit entirely, completing rehab successfully and getting clean again. He was also attending Hunter College, working on getting his master's degree in psychology. He celebrated by returning to the shelter and seeing those he had met in the past, showing that if he was able to make these changes and start the process to get his old life back, so could they. They might have been homeless, But this did not mean they didn't have a future. It wasn't easy, and he was still in the process of getting his living situation in order. There were a lot of issues in the way, but he was getting there. On Halloween evening, Carlos was leaving his girlfriend's apartment on the Manhattan side of the bridge. He started to walk towards Island, and as he approached the end of the bridge, he would come across the bloodthirsty mob, completely unaware that he was next. They surrounded him, all wielding their weapons, ordering him to, quote, give it up, in reference to money or anything else he might have had on him. But when he refused, he was viciously attacked. They hit him at full force, striking him with everything they had. At first, Carlos escaped, able to run away from the mob in the direction of the shelter, but it wouldn't take long for them to catch up to him. They used their hands, weapons, and feet to beat and stomp him into the ground. They used a bat to beat his body and skull. They used the cleaver to hack him all over his body as he fought to get loose. He was stabbed repeatedly by one or more people as they continued to beat his body with whatever they had their hands on. Then, as if his life meant absolutely nothing, they took one of their knives or the cleaver and used it to cut Carlos's throat open, leaving his beaten and battered body laying in the path among the weeds. The mob then ran back across the footbridge toward Manhattan, leaving Carlos with his life slipping away as he bled out. Anthony, one of the first attacked, was running away trying to save himself, still badly injured, when he saw Carlos lying on the ground, still alive. Anthony said he looked down and could see Carlos gasping for air, his eyes looking straight at his, likely hoping someone would help him. But there wasn't much Anthony could do. He had to keep running. A few minutes later, Carlos Melendez would succumb to his devastating injuries, his body left lying among the bottles that littered the area. A man who had every intention on fixing his life, butchered for absolutely no reason at all. News of Carlos's death made its way around the entire tri-state area. What happened on the island drew attention to an issue that had been growing for years, with very little being done to stop it. Not just here, but all across the city. News of homeless men and women being attacked was popping up more and more, but something about this night struck a different nerve. The idea that a group of what might be teenagers were committing such callous crimes couldn't be overlooked. It was clear they didn't see those living on the street as human, and they had very little regard for human life. This was more than just a prank, and not just an innocent Halloween night with friends. It was cold-blooded murder, plain and simple. Within hours, authorities were now trying to find out who was responsible. They gathered statements from numerous witnesses on and off the bridge who had seen the group attacking others. They spoke to people who saw when and where it all happened, even where the attackers were said to run off to. The investigation would lead them to the East River houses, right next to the Footbridge on the Manhattan side. At first, it was thought that the group either lived in the East River houses, or at the very least, used them as a place to group up before launching their attacks. After questioning many in those houses and surrounding areas, police now knew they were looking for a group who they believed didn't live very far. As news of Carlos's heartless slaying made its way around, the fear in people was increasing. Members of the shelter on the island started to form groups to watch each other's backs and prevent this from happening again. Very quickly, a fed-up East Harlem community would flood the Crime Stoppers tip line with key information. People were outraged, many of whom had similar run-ins with groups like this. They feared for their own safety and that of their children. Many of those anonymous calls gave authorities nicknames and street names of those believed to be responsible for Carlos's brutal slaying. It wouldn't take very long for arrests to be made. By November 2nd, 2 days later, they already had their sights set on a group, and by Monday, November 5th of 1990, they had a total of 7 in custody. While there were more people running with the group that night, these were the individuals they believed actually attacked people on the bridge and island. They arrested 23-year-old Robert Sherman of the Bronx, 22-year-old Raymond Fenner, 16-year-old John Moreno, 15-year-old Hector Torres, 13-year-old Aaron Ware, 18-year-old Leon Robinson, and 18-year-old Reynolds Walker, all of East Harlem. An 8th suspect, 18-year-old Eric Williams, was charged in a separate incident that same night when it came to the attempted murder of another man on the island. His name was Roosevelt Jones. Williams was said to have badly beaten Jones with a pipe, striking his head and face, cracking his head open. Leon Robinson, one of the 7, was originally arrested in connection to an armed robbery on the Upper East Side. He robbed a woman at gunpoint in a nail salon, making off with about $50,000 in jewelry and $300 in cash. Victims of the attack who thought they heard young voices turned out to be correct. Almost half of those apprehended were indeed teenagers. Through questioning, investigators would come to the conclusion that 18-year-old Reynolds Walker was the ringleader of the mob, along with help from Leon Robinson. But with a number of suspects already in custody, it was hard to say what really transpired and in what order. As authorities worked to get the story straight and piece together exactly how that tragic evening unfolded, Carlos was about to be laid to rest. On Saturday, November 17th of 1990, a service was held for Carlos Melendez. It was held on Ward's Island, organized by Reverend Walker, a pastor at the Gospel Blessing Center on Long Island, New York. He stepped in to organize the service when he saw Carlos's body hadn't yet been claimed. Before finalizing the arrangements for the service, Carlos's sister came forward. Around 100 people would attend to pay their respects, his sister being one of them. The last time she saw her brother alive was just 2 weeks prior to Halloween night. They always remained in contact through ups and downs. However, she wasn't aware that he lived in a shelter. She thought he was staying with his girlfriend. This memorial served as a way to let other victims know that someone out there cared. It wasn't just being pushed aside, and regardless of what Carlos had experienced in his life, he deserved to be remembered for who he truly was, just a man looking to get his life back, and he was doing everything necessary to make that possible. After life taking a turn and fighting an uphill battle for years, he was almost there, only for his life to be taken for absolutely no reason. Director of the Ward's Island shelter, Ken Berger, would also attend the service. He had the following to say: "Violence against the homeless in New York is a daily fact of life, but the violence against Carlos is the most vicious kind. This kind of violence must stop." Carlos was then cremated, with his remains being flown back to California to be buried by his former wife and 9-year-old son. While heinous acts against the homeless wasn't anything new in 1990, Carlos's slaying stirred up a lot of emotions in the 5 boroughs. It was particularly cold. Just knowing that these teens and these men could just take a life for fun like this was a huge wake-up call. An act of violence that just couldn't go unpunished, and the community was demanding that something be done about it. On the morning of Monday, December 3rd of 1990, the 7 were indicted on charges for rioting, assault, depraved indifference, and murder. While the details of what took place that Halloween night in 1990 had been circulating since just days after it happened, later on, once the suspects were in a courtroom facing trial, the details were revealed to be much, much worse. While there were 7 indicted for the crimes, the focus would remain on those that authorities believed to be guilty of inflicting the most severe damage. Moreno and Robinson were part of the same trial, with the rest of the suspects being tried separately. When a member of the medical examiner's office took to the stand, it would be revealed that Carlos had sustained at least 20 stab wounds. He was mercilessly beaten upon his face, head, and body, resulting in his chest being crushed, also causing his intestines to, quote, burst from his body. His throat was cut with either a knife or a meat cleaver, both of which were used in the attack. It seems they never had intentions on letting Carlos make it off that island alive. It turns out that 2 of the suspects, Reynolds Walker and John Moreno, were drug dealers. That night, right as they were about to launch an attack on the island, they recognized one of the men there. He was someone who had purchased drugs from them in the past. They told the others to leave him alone because they knew him. They had already been arrested for selling crack months before this. John Moreno was also best friends with Hector Torres, one of the 7. Moreno's father stated that he knew something bad would happen that night. He begged his son to stay home where it was safe. His son made it back home that night, but he wasn't acting like himself. He acted weird for days, but his father couldn't pinpoint a reason. That's until one of Moreno's friends came over to his home saying that Torres had snitched on them. That's when Moreno told his father that he was involved. He then told the same to authorities and gave a videotaped statement detailing exactly what took place. Reynolds Walker would also provide a videotaped statement. A jury would learn that this entire incident started much earlier that Halloween day. Some statements said the group gathered on East 104th and 2nd Ave a little before 12 o'clock noon, and other statements mentioned that some in the group were also from further uptown, residents of the Wagner houses. The group, armed with weapons, grew over the hours as they roamed the neighborhood throwing eggs at passing cars and messing with trick-or-treaters. The teens and men stated that the reason they were armed was because on Halloween of 1989, just a year before this, their neighborhood was invaded by rival gang members who started to rob and attack them. Halloween in the city was once seen as a big day for gang initiations, so this isn't surprising to hear. They said they were preparing for what they thought was coming. But still, it made no sense why Carlos was the one who had to suffer. And those gang members that they said they were preparing for never even showed up. What was left was a mob that grew to at least 15, and some of them had been drinking and smoking for part of the day, only adding more fuel to the fire. That's when Robinson suggested that they, quote, hit the bridge, bringing their taste for violence towards Island, resulting in several injured and Carlos Melendez dead. It wasn't about Robin, it was about Wilden, suspect Reynolds Walker said. He also stated he saw no blood during his attack, and it wasn't him who took Carlos's life. The term Wilden had gained nationwide attention going back a few years, back when the Central Park jogger case first broke. It was around for a while before that, but when this happened, the papers were still looking for a solid definition of what it meant. Residents of Uptown and Harlem were asked what their definitions were.
Tell me, what's wilding?
That means like they going out starting trouble and stuff. Beating up people.
Yeah?
Yeah.
You heard that expression a lot?
Yes.
Let me talk to you. You know what wilding is?
It's like a whole bunch of people start going around beating people up.
Yeah? You hear that expression a lot?
Sometimes.
Yeah? What's it mean to you?
Nothing. I don't go.
You don't go? Okay. What's wilding mean?
That means people going around beating up each other up and starting things. Like just going around beating people up whoever they see.
Okay, thank you.
By those definitions, what this mob did on Halloween night fit the description perfectly. No rhyme or reason, no provocation, just a bunch of people venturing onto Ward's Island with one goal in mind, going on a violent spree to cause physical harm. Just a random act of heinous violence, a thrill kill which ended with monsters taking someone's life in cold blood just because they could. After witness testimony, pleas entered, and experts taking the stand to describe Carlos's last moments, the verdict was in. After all the trials were done, the following sentences were handed out. Aaron Ware, 13 at the time of the attack, pleaded guilty to first-degree assault. He was found guilty, but he was sentenced as a juvenile. The details of his sentencing were kept confidential due to his age. The same could be said for the other minors involved. 16-year-old John Moreno, whom was said to be the first to approach Carlos and demand cash, was found guilty, and 15-year-old Hector Torres was also found guilty. Any information pertaining to their sentencing was kept sealed. Prosecutors will conclude that Reynolds Walker, who pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in 1991, was the person who used a meat cleaver to cut Carlos's throat. He was also a part of the beating. It all played a major role in his death. He was sentenced to 18 years to life in prison. He was released on parole in 2021. Throughout the trial, he and Moreno maintained that they weren't the ones who delivered the fatal injuries. As for the rest who were originally apprehended, it's unclear exactly what happened. Reports later on either have conflicting information, or information was kept confidential altogether. The reason why remains unclear. What took place on Halloween of 1990 said a lot about the state the city was in, a time when living on the streets came with a very dangerous set of challenges, some that might cost an innocent person their life, issues that have existed since long before and after this all happened, an event that sent a ripple of fear through anyone who called the streets their home. It's safe to say that nobody plans for their life to go this way. Nobody thinks a life of homelessness is in their future until they're living it. Nobody plans to lose everything and have to start all over. Nobody plans on being looked at as less than human for not having a place to rest their head at night. Nobody plans on living their life on the street only to be targeted and brutally slain as if their life meant nothing. Taking someone's life for absolutely no reason is something only monsters are capable of. Call it what you want. Wilding, gang assault, it's all the same. Carlos was fighting to get his life in order. He didn't lead a perfect life, but then again, who really does? He should have lived to see where his hard work might have taken him. That chance was snatched away the second he stepped foot on this bridge, the night he came face to face with the mob who would take his life without a second thought. Carlos was making all the necessary changes to improve his life. When they attacked him, they didn't see a man. They didn't see a father. They didn't see a former husband or a hard worker. All they saw was an opportunity to inflict pain. Those directly involved have the chance to move on and change their lives, fix their mistakes, and make better decisions going forward. Exactly what Carlos was trying to do when his life was taken. Time and time again, Carlos would tell a friend of his how he never wanted to die on the streets, a fear that in the end became a horrifying reality. If alive today, he would be 70 years old. Rest in peace, Carlos Melendez, and my deepest condolences go out to his family and loved ones. You aren't forgotten.